Good afternoon, and thank you all for attending the ASCB LSE webinar series. I'll be turning it over to Paul Hernandez, who will be our moderator for today.
Great. Well, hey, thank you very much. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce here Dr. Julia Gouvea. She has her PhD from University of California at Davis in science education and is currently an assistant professor at Tufts University. And I'm like all of you, I'm very excited to have her introduce herself here and also talk to us about her recent paper. So with that, Julia, please take it away.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Welcome, everyone. And before I start, I just want to really quickly acknowledge my co-author, Matt Simon, who is a PhD student of mine and who not only helped with the data analysis in this study, but also just has been a fantastic thinking partner. So I'm very fortunate to have a student like Matt and many other students as well. So I'd like to just get right into it. The title of today's webinar is How Deeply Held Are Misconceptions? And that is because really at the heart of this paper is this question about the nature of cognition. How do we think about and how do we model how people think? And in the paper, we kind of do an overview of different models of thinking about cognition, and we call those kind of more framework-like models and more dynamic models. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of that and the logic of our study. So just quickly, framework models model cognition as these kind of durable collections of ideas, and in particular, intuitive cognition. So we're talking about how do novices think? So one way to think about that is they have these underlying frameworks, and those frameworks can be flawed, and that can lead them to have these deeply held misconceptions. An alternative to framework models is more dynamic models of cognition, where we think about novices as not necessarily having durable underlying frameworks for how they're thinking, but that their thinking is a bit more in the moment. It's a bit more sensitive and responsive to context. It's composed of, you see here I have a flock of birds, these kind of different ideas. And that what we see in a moment when someone is thinking and talking about how they're thinking is we see some subset of that underlying collection of ideas that they have, that they're bringing together in that particular moment to respond to some particular situation. So I'll talk more about those two models if people have questions, but that's kind of the basic idea. And then if you think about, and I guess the reason that that's so important is that different models of cognition can lead to different kinds of interpretations of data, of what we think about when we see students thinking. So fundamentally, cognition is inferred. We can't directly observe it. And if you're thinking about cognition in a more framework way or a more dynamic way, you might have different interpretations of what students are saying and doing. So here's an example that brings us into the kind of content of the paper. If a student says or agrees with or writes down a statement like this, plants produce oxygen so that animals can breathe. You could take that as a kind of evidence that perhaps they have an underlying, as it's called in the paper, teleological framework. So that means that they have some underlying intuitive set of ideas about the world as fundamentally teleological, which means that objects in the world have these functions that they perform that is the basis for how you think about them. So in this case, the plants produce oxygen. That's their function. It's an intentional function to help animals breathe, which of course is not a kind of biologically correct way to think about what plants do. And so in Coley and Tanner's study, that's the paper that we really engage with deeply in our paper, they found that students would agree with and write things like some of these statements, teleological, essentialist, or anthropocentric. And that was really provocative for me because it got me thinking, like, what does it mean for a student to say or agree with a statement like this? Do they really sort of fundamentally think about the world in a teleological way, or is there some other way to explain why they would say things like this? And in particular, I remember thinking, like, could I just ask a follow-up question? Like, if you really believe that the entire reason plants exist on Earth is to produce oxygen for animals, like if I said this statement to you, animals need to breathe is what causes plants to produce oxygen, would you also agree with that? And that would be a way for me to kind of gauge like your degree of commitment to this like stable underlying teleological framework, or is there a need to think about other explanations? So using that kind of basic logic, we put together a survey that had the following structure. So first we used the original kinds of misconception statements. So here you can see the plant statement, and asked students to agree or disagree, much in the same way that the original study did. And then we created these contrasting statements, one that really kind of ramped up the teleological content of the statement in this case, or the essentialist content, or the anthropocentric content. So here's that animals need to breathe is what causes plants to produce oxygen. And then another statement that corrected it, that said, in this case, plants produce oxygen and then animals are able to breathe it. And the logic of this was, well, we just wanted to know what would happen. So if students agree with that first statement, how do they deal then with this pair of statements? Are they really committed to this idea that, you know, that's what causes plants to produce oxygen? Or when they look at these, are they like, well, that's not really what I meant? So one version of this survey looked like this. Another version of the survey flipped the responses. And the logic here was that perhaps if students got this first comparison, when they saw the plants produce oxygen so that animals can breathe statement, they would kind of be more aware of what they were agreeing to or not, right? That's one interpretation, that they would be like queued up to think, well, wait a minute, do I really agree with this statement? I think this might be a trick and I want to think about more carefully what I'm agreeing to. So we call these two versions of the survey the queued version. This is where they get queued with the comparison first, or the unqueued, where they're responding to that agree statement before they see the paired response. And I'm just going to really quick show two figures from our results. The first figure is going to compare the queued and the unqueued responses, and just to give you an example. So that means I'm comparing how much did students agree with the plants produce oxygen so that animals can breathe statement, if they either saw it first or if they saw it second. So here's what one of the figures from the paper that shows how in this particular case with teleology, there was a lot of reduction in agreement if you first saw those pair of statements. Another way we looked at the data was to track individuals through their survey responses. So I'll walk you through these figures really quickly here. But if you just look at the left side of the screen here, that's part A. So again, they're getting this, do you agree with this statement first? Then they're getting the pairs. And then in the last bubble, they're being asked to write a statement explaining why they agree, why they chose the answers that they chose. So you can see in part A here that for an example like the plants question, there'd be a lot of agreement at first. But then when students encounter the pair, lots of students, 62 students, for example, who agreed with that original statement, chose the corrected statement and said, actually, I'm not choosing the stronger version of that anymore. And then if we look at their written responses, you can see that 115 students, when we coded their written responses, they wrote things that we coded as removing or rejecting the teleology from the statement. So for example, they'd write something like, you know, that's not the reason plants produce oxygen. The reason plants produce oxygen is because, well, I don't remember what they say. They would say things like, well, plants produce oxygen because that's what they do. It's not for animals, for example. And then you can see the survey B, that's where they're encountering the choice first. You see a lot more students initially choosing the correct thing and then kind of consistently staying with the corrected versions. So just as a whole, I'm going to stop talking, but overall, that kind of said to us, okay, there are other things going on here besides students being deeply committed to these teleological, essentialist, or anthropocentric ideas.
Great, thank you for that brief summary of your article. So to to all of our attendees, I just want to orient you really quickly, and then we'll jump back into some Q&A. But the goal here for this for this, I don't know what to call it, webinar, for this journal club, is really to give you a behind the scenes look into how educational studies are designed, developed, implemented. And so I've got some questions I'm gonna ask, but I really strongly encourage all of you to submit questions. We want to hear your questions using the Q&A feature. So if you look within the Zoom window down at the bottom, you'll see Q&A, and you can submit a variety of questions there. And I'll read through your questions and try to synthesize them and post them to Dr. Gouvea as we go along. Okay, so with that said, let's jump back into the study, and I'll start with a few seed questions, but folks, I'd like you to be submitting yours as well for the Q&A. So first of all, Dr. Gouvea, why do you think the contrast between framework models and dynamic models is important to study? What turns you on to this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's actually quite important to me. And as I said, I guess here's the thing. I think that framework models of cognition, this idea that students have deeply held and incorrect ways of thinking about the world, is a pretty common way that we in the field think about students. And folks can please correct me if I'm wrong. I'm actually kind of curious how people will respond to that. But I feel like it's out there in the air, and it's kind of a common way to talk about students. They have these deeply held wrong ideas. And I think that I don't necessarily agree with that. I think there's a lot of data and theoretical reasons to think that is not always the case. And I think the widespreadness of thinking about it that way has implications for research and teaching, frankly. So in terms of research, I think it really narrows and constrains our focus to identifying wrong ideas and misconceptions. And it also kind of, I think, makes us feel satisfied that we understand how people are thinking as soon as we hear kind of a wrong idea. Like that's the sum total of how a student is thinking. So in a way, I think it really obscures the potential complexity of how people think, to kind of make assumptions about their underlying frameworks. It doesn't force us to ask, like, is that really how they're thinking in all contexts and over time? And I think I'd say the same for teaching. I think it gives us this false sense that we understand students. Like, oh, they said this thing, I can identify that as a common misconception. As long as I correct that common misconception, then I've done my job as a teacher. I think it limits the way we engage with students. Whereas I think if you're coming at it from a dynamic perspective, you're saying, well, what made them say that? Like, how are they really thinking? Maybe I want to ask more questions of them and more deeply engage with their thinking. So for me, it's this really pervasive idea that I feel quite strongly about, and I think has these really broad implications for both how we do research and teaching, like I said.
Great, thank you. A follow-up question has come through.
Okay.
And so what are your thoughts then about how do we capture then more dynamic models? How do we capture these dynamic ways that students, or that we, just people, might think if it's not in this kind of fixed framework?
Capture, I'm assuming, means something like measure?
Yeah, how do we capture, how do we measure the dynamic ways in which they, if I'm reading this question correctly, the dynamic ways in which they think?
So it's interesting. I kind of think about it like cognition is about as complex as at least an ecosystem, right? You're going to imagine that there's a lot of interacting parts and that things are changing over time. So if you were going to study an ecosystem, you wouldn't just kind of walk in one day and take one snapshot and then assume that you understood it. You would study it over time, right? So that means like watching students, like literally watching them, doing more naturalistic studies of video. You would study that ecosystem in lots of different ways. So as that pertains to students, you might really consider how can their thinking be perturbed if I give them a prompt that's worded differently, or if I ask them a question in a different way. So I think both time and perturbation, I guess, are two big ideas that I think about when I think about studying cognition dynamically.
Great, great. Not a follow-up question. So there are many possible ways kind of to test opposing predictions, and you've kind of set that up in your literature review of two opposing theories about the way students work, and many possible ways even with that to then test predictions about stability versus dynamic cognitive frameworks. How did you decide on designing your study to really falsify claims about stability?
Well, I guess partly I would say that I approach all of my research kind of with this default possibility that thinking could be dynamic. And so I do a lot of qualitative research. I analyze video, I analyze interviews, and I'm always looking, I'm coming to it with this framework of wondering and tracking ideas over time. So I think I wouldn't have thought maybe to do this, but I think that the study that Coley and Tanner did was really interesting and provocative and rare in a way, because it kind of took a stand. And like I said earlier, even though I think that this idea that deeply held misconceptions exist in students is widespread, I don't think a lot of people actually study it. So this was an example of someone, a group of researchers saying, like, we're going to study it and we have predictions and we're going to test them. And when I saw it, I thought, like, okay, I have different predictions and different interpretations, and I really want to engage with that. So it was really provoked by that original study as a way to really be explicit about how the predictions can differ if you come in with a different theoretical perspective.
Okay, kind of a follow-up question from the participants here. In thinking still about the design of your study, what was the main function of showing students both the corrected and the flipped cue? So the cued and uncued version, just translating a bit there.
Wait, sorry, I confused myself.
So the question is, like, what was the main function of showing students both the cued and uncued? Some of them got uncued followed by, some of them got the response, the standard response from the prior study, and then you had them pick between the two opposing. Some got the flip version of that. So what was the main function of showing them both the corrected and the flipped cue?
So I'm still not completely sure I'm interpreting the question correctly.
Me too.
So one version of the question is, why have two versions of the survey? But another version of the question would be, why show them both a corrected and an amplified version as a pair?
I think that's the intent of this question, that second one.
Okay. Yeah, that is a good question, actually. Now, I have to think about whether, so I guess maybe to answer that, it might sort of be an artifact of how this was inspired, which was that, so I'm not a person who designs surveys normally, but I had seen some really creative use of surveys, primarily from, I believe it was Andy Elby's student, Tim McCaskey, had this really interesting survey in his dissertation where it's physics education. And the survey was structured such that you'd ask students a question about physics, and then you'd say, choose the answer that you most agree with, and circle that, and then choose the answer that you think a physicist would most agree with and box that. And so this idea of there being like a split or like a pair of ways you could answer a thing kind of got stuck in my mind. I think I was also influenced a little bit by literature on contrasting cases, about how, like, when you see something that's different, your attention gets cued into the thing that's different. So for example, in the plants thing, if you see the pair of statements, the idea was you'd look at those two statements and be like, what's different about these two statements? Oh, the thing that's different is this one is implying that plants exist to help animals and the other one doesn't. So now that idea of teleology is really present and amplified in your mind. When you then hit the next statement, it's easier to see that's what that statement is implying. So that's why we call it a cue. Like it's bringing your attention to what could otherwise, I think, be missed in the statement. That was part of our conversations in designing this, is that you could agree with that statement, you know, plants produce oxygen so that animals can breathe, without really intending or understanding that that's what you're agreeing to. So hopefully that answers that question.
Thank you. Kind of a similar question that's coming out of the chat box. You know, so it says data on cueing suggests students often answer questions incorrectly, maybe based on poorly worded questions. Is this a reflection on the ways in which we test or the ways in which we teach the content?
That students are answering incorrectly?
Right, because of a poorly worded question.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, yes, I think so. I think students can get tricked by questions just like anyone can get tricked in multiple choice situation. So yes, although I guess I'm sort of hesitating because I'm trying to imagine what would like it's hard to avoid in a multiple choice format. It's hard to have a question that's just perfectly worded that everyone's gonna understand in exactly the same way. So it's a kind of a fundamental limitation of that kind of measure, right? Like, again, as I said, if you take the ecosystem analogy, if you're gonna just go in there and take one water sample, that's not gonna give you the full picture. So on the one hand, yes, and I think it's definitely possible to make really well worded multiple choice questions as opposed to really poor, but at the same time, the medium is limited no matter how well you word it.
And a follow-up question to that, still thinking about the way things are worded. One of the participants asked if you noticed any difference in the way that, you know, students who speak English as a second or third or fourth language, did they respond differently to the prompts? Were they more susceptible to the wording?
Oh, that's such a great question. Unfortunately, we don't have that data. The survey was just conducted anonymously. We wanted to not collect a lot of data from students, but that's a great question. There's a lot of literature on the importance of thinking about that, and honestly, it's kind of an underlying motivation for this kind of work, which is to say that people think differently, certainly, and that has consequences for equity in lots of ways. I mean, it's well known that if English is not your first language, you can struggle on standardized tests, and you know, any kind of assessment that's going to depend on your really precise understanding of wording is going to be more challenging for you. So yeah, I think what that really raises for me is this idea that if, especially for students for whom English is not their first language, if they say something and it sounds wrong to you, you might think that they have a misconception that they just don't really have, and that it's really an issue of communicating, and that is a reason to really persist in trying to follow up and better understand how students are thinking rather than kind of assume based on what they say in a short interaction.
Great, thank you. I mean, picking up on that cue about equity, we have a question here from panelists wanting to know, you know, this panelist teaches at an institution with a large number of underrepresented minority students, where they, as the faculty, are being challenged to be more inclusive in the ways that they teach their science, and I would assume also assess understanding of their science. So how do you see your work? How do you see your work influencing the ways in which both this science is taught and assessed, given what you've seen in the way that students are changing their responses?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about assessment from a dynamic perspective, then you're going to be very sort of disappointed with what you're going to be able to assess, right? It's just, and I think some people have asked me, like, is there a way to to get around it. And I guess kind of my response is, like, if you just really buy into the fact that cognition is complex and it's sensitive to context and it's dynamic, then there isn't going to be a way for you to simply assess it. That's just not a goal that is going to be easy to do. And we should stop pretending that we can. We should stop thinking that it's going to be easy to understand how people think. I don't necessarily have an answer, but I think part of what's necessary is to complicate the way we talk about assessment, and to not pretend that we know what someone knows or what they've learned from very simple assessments. I guess I would also maybe, so the way I reconcile it is I change what I care about in assessments. So if I say, look, I'm not going to know for sure what this person knows, and I'm not even sure if a person says this to me, if a student says to me the correct thing, that's like representative of their underlying cognition. So what do I care about? I care more about promoting their own ability to think and assessing the extent to which I have given them opportunities to do complicated and critical thinking. So I do things like assessing how students are making arguments and things like that, rather than their content, the way that they're representing content back to me. But I certainly don't have all the answers to this. I think it's a really challenging question, and that's kind of part of my point, is that it's challenging.
Thank you. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, and one of the earlier questions that I think we can transition to here is to do with participants saying, you know, I do think, and here it's in quotes, I think we, so that the discipline does believe in these deeply held beliefs, in response to one of your earlier questions. However, I've always wondered, how do students, how do they get there? You know, how do they get to this point? How do we have different educational goals? We all have different educational goals and life experiences from which we learn from. And so how do students get to the point where they potentially hold misconceptions?
Well, I think it depends on kind of your theoretical understanding, you know, how you're thinking theoretically about what a misconception even is. So let's see. I'll take an example that's not from this study, because I just think it's easier to think about. So I don't know how many of you have seen, but if you haven't, you can Google this. There's this video called The Private Universe, and it's quite famous, and it's interviewing Harvard graduates on their graduation day, and they're all in their cap and gown. And the interviewer is asking them, what causes the seasons? And, you know, Harvard grad after Harvard grad is saying it's because, well, obviously in the summer we get closer to the sun, and so it's warmer, and that's what causes seasons. You know, so if you think about, like, why are they saying that? Like, how did this happen? I think that's what the video is intended to provoke. Like, how could this be that a Harvard graduate doesn't know what causes the seasons? And I think you can think about it, and the way theoretically researchers who think about cognition in this dynamic way, this knowledge in pieces way, is they say, well, you know, you have these aspects of your prior experience, and in particular moments, you use those to make sense of the world. And it sort of depends on a lot of things. Like, for example, if you're at graduation and someone's interviewing you in your cap and gown, you're not going to like take the time to think deeply about how you're going to respond. You're just going to say the first thing that comes to mind, in part because you don't want to look like you don't know the answer immediately, maybe, or whatever. So you might have this intuitive sense that, like, when you're closer to a hot thing, you're warmer. That's what it's called in P-prims, right? Closer means hotter. So, like, it makes intuitive sense to me. Closer to the sun, you kind of know about the solar system. You might even know the fact that the orbit of the Earth is not completely symmetrical. You sort of take these bits and pieces of what you understand, you construct an explanation in that moment, and it looks like you have this deep, deep misconception, like fundamentally don't understand the solar system. And then if I took that same Harvard grad to like a bar afterwards and was like, hey, let's talk about the seasons, like, would they be able to say something else? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's kind of the way that I think about it. I do think that it is possible to have a wrong idea for a really long time. I'm not saying that. I think it comes from not having had to examine that idea or think deeply about it. And so that's kind of what I think we need to give students the chance to do, right? I want to take that Harvard student and be like, okay, seriously though, like, because you know that if it's summer here, on the other side of the world, it's winter. So how are you going to deal with that? And then I want to help them talk through it. I think that that's how you undo these wrong ideas, but I fundamentally don't think that they have no other way to think and that they're never going to be able to change their mind.
As a kind of follow-up question, one of the panelists wrote there, it's interesting to see that students remained committed to theological ideas. More students remain committed to logical ideas than anthropocentric and essentialist ideas. Does this suggest that some students have static frameworks with regard to these ideas, whereas others have more dynamic frameworks?
Oh, that's such a great question. That would not be my interpretation. I have an interpretation of why that is, and I think it's because the teleological questions are just fundamentally trickier. I think they more easily align with almost correct ways of thinking. So if you take the, let's see, I have to look at my slides here for once. Oops, now I've done something. Hold on. Well, it doesn't matter. If you look at the question that's about species adapting, I can't remember how it's worded, or even the camouflage question, I think it just aligns with the way people tend to talk about adaptation. So species adapt to the environment in order to survive. Like, that's not right. They don't adapt in order to survive, but it sounds kind of like very similar to what the correct thing is. So I think it's just harder to detect the teleology in those statements. And I think if you really pressed a student, they wouldn't be like, well, I don't mean that like, it's like, I need to survive, now I'm going to adapt. They understand that there's a relationship between survival and adaptation. That's what they're seeing in the statement, and that's what they're responding to. So that would be my interpretation of why those ones, you get more agreement on those. Whereas if you look at the anthropocentric and some of the essentialist ones, they're just sort of more obviously wrong. Like, once you see the flaw, you're like, well, that's obviously not right. Like, I didn't mean the heart can decide things. So I think it's more to do with the nuance of the different questions, would be my interpretation.
Okay. And I'm not sure if this is a direct follow-up, but it seems somewhat related. So one of the panelists says, their goal as an instructor is to help students develop a stable framework, but with accurate information.
Sure.
To be able to apply that framework across contexts. Is that a reasonable goal for an undergraduate class? And if so, then how comfortable do you feel, I assume this means should he or she feel about grading students' answers when they display inaccurate ideas? Is it a good goal to help them develop these stable frameworks, and how does that impact assessment?
I mean, I don't think that I would say it's a bad goal. I do think it could be a goal that gets in the way of other goals. So it's a complicated question for me to answer. I guess one way that I just think about learning environments is that you can't just have a list of goals and achieve all of those goals. Some goals are intention. And so if I'm going to focus on correcting students' wrong ideas, that might be in tension with their own ability to develop as critical thinkers and arguers, for lots of reasons. Like, it might just focus them on trying to memorize the right thing or learn what I say, and they're not taking the time to question and critically reflect on their own thinking because they're so concerned about correctness. So Yeah, I don't know that I can really I'm not sure exactly what this question is really getting at, but that's one way to answer it, is that I'm not opposed to them developing good ideas. I just don't want that to get in the way of them being able to think for themselves.
I'm going to transition again now and talk about a number of folks have questions on the survey, and I think the design of the survey. So let's
Sure.
move through some of those. So one of the questions is, let's see, I'm trying to pick amongst a number of them. So I love the ecology analogy that you use, and I see the importance of making rich observations to try to understand and measure the ways students think. How do you balance this need with the need to measure thinking in large samples of students?
The need to measure thinking in large samples of students. I guess I don't understand where that need is coming from. So is it a need that is a research need? Like, unless I measure thinking in large numbers of students, I won't understand at a large sample size. I guess in that case, if that's, so I'll just go with these. If that's the way that the question is intended, then yeah, it's the same kind of trade-off that you'd face as an ecologist, right? Like you can study one organism's behavior in depth and watch it over time, or you can try to capture hundreds of organisms' behavior, but you're gonna lose some of the complexity. I guess partly what I'm trying to advocate for in the field, maybe even, is that I don't think we've done a lot of that kind of work. I don't think we've done a lot of natural history of cognition. I think we've jumped into a lot of large N quantitative work without maybe putting in the time to understand the dynamics of how individuals think. And so I think as a field, we could use more of that work before, or maybe in not before, like it's already obviously happening, but to complement a large N approaches and to give us a way to interpret the data that we get from large samples. As you saw in this study, we sort of did both things, right? This is not the typical way I would conduct research, but we were able to still kind of look deeply at even these fragments of what students wrote in their responses, and look at each one and ask, like, what can we tell about student thinking from this little fragment of what they said? And I think it's possible to do that even with large samples, as long as you're really honest with yourself, like, what are my underlying assumptions, and what am I inferring from this, and are there alternative explanations that I have to take into consideration? I can't remember. I think I had another interpretation, but I don't remember what it was. So
No, I think that's and in fact, I think it leads into a follow-up question that one of the participants had. It says, thinking now, I mean, you talked about the fact you do normally design a survey to include these various pieces to it, but the follow-up question is, how did the qualitative kind of open response data inform your interpretations of the quantitative survey results?
Well, a lot. I mean, I think, it's one thing to see if someone agreed or disagreed with a statement, but then when we looked at what that student actually wrote, I think it really helped us think about the pattern of their responses over time. So in the paper, we talk about this one example where this student wrote something that sounds very, I think it was teleological in their statement. And then we look at how they answered another statement, and it was the opposite. It was like, I don't think that camouflage evolves out of some need, or I don't remember the exact details. But so yeah, we were able to really complicate our own assumptions, even in the case where all students' responses aligned with a particular interpretation. Like, this student is, for this question, teleological. If we looked at other questions, we got a more nuanced response. And I think it also helped us think about the patterns. Like, I can't think of a really good example right now. I think especially in some of the more confusing questions, like, without outside influences, ecological communities will remain stable indefinitely. Like, we couldn't tell why people were agreeing or disagreeing with that statement, or why they were choosing the alternatives that we'd provided. When we started looking at their written statements, it became apparent that they were really confused just by the prompt. They were like, what does outside influences mean? Is the sun an outside influence? Is wind an outside influence? Like how, I don't know. And that really helped us understand that agreeing or disagreeing had a lot to do with how they were interpreting the question. That was something we couldn't know without looking at their qualitative responses.
So thinking still about that, so one of the follow-up questions here, what sort of groundwork or scaffolding might be necessary for optimizing both students' cognition and their responses to questions?
I don't think I understand the question. In what context?
Well, so let's think about still in the survey context. How do we need to think about the way we pose questions to students in an assessment, so that we better assess what their thinking is? Clearly, there are some problems, right, that you've identified in terms of there's a lot of variability. Just by changing the wording a little bit, you get this dramatic variability in responses, switching responses. So can you talk a little bit about how should we be framing questions to students to get a more accurate sense of their thinking?
I see, yeah. Right, so what's common, and I assume lots of folks who do surveys do this kind of work, is to just do extensive interviewing with students before creating surveys like this. So that means, and then, so talking to students, like, how are you thinking about this idea? And then as much as possible, using language that comes from students in the survey, right? So if you hear a lot of students talking in these ways, trying to use language that is as natural and, you know, as possible. Again, you're not going to be able to, because people are different, you're not going to be able to create items that mean the same thing unilaterally. And then ongoing testing, right? So you have a student take a survey and then you sit down with them and go over their answers and say, what does this mean to you? And why did you answer this? So yeah, actually, I think building and validating surveys is often requires a lot of in-depth qualitative work, trying to just as best you possibly can account for all the differences in interpretation that you're going to find.
And that, great. I think we don't have time for too many more of these questions now, but I'm going to transition a little bit. And one of the questions here posed was, you covered you covered figure 4 a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about the small number of students in version B who actually ended up agreeing with the construal? And is this a measure of the number of students who truly hold some uninformed understanding?
Okay, so I'm going to look at my own version of the paper here. The small number of students, can you just repeat that, Paul?
Yeah, a small number of students in version B actually ended up agreeing with the construal. I think what is meant there is the misconception.
Okay. Well, in version B, they first see the 2, right? Mm-hmm. And then they see the agree, disagree statement. So if they agree, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that my response is going to be the same for any question like this, which is, I'm not entirely sure what it means. I don't think I would interpret it as them holding a deep misconception unless I had more information. So as you can see in the figures, a lot of students who agreed with the misconception statement went on to write statements that removed or rejected. Maybe the person is asking about the small number of students at the very end who wrote in their explanations in language that did not reject or remove the construal. And in that case, you know, there's like 17 students, 12 students in one, 17 in another. in that case, do I think that those students are the ones that have these deeply held teleological frameworks? And again, I would say, I don't know, because I don't know if what they're writing down reflects their underlying cognition, or if they just literally, even though they've gotten all the way through the survey, it hasn't occurred to them that this is the claim that they're actually making. And I gave the example earlier, but it's also in the paper, of a student who agreed all the way through with the wrong statements on one question in teleology, but then disagreed in another question. So how to make sense of that, I think would require really interviewing that student and saying, you know, what are you thinking about this?
Great, thank you. All right, well, let's transition a little bit here, and let's talk about the implications of your study. And we've been doing a bit of that already, but based on your work here, what do you recommend to biological education researchers to do better to test different models of cognition?
Yeah, so right, I have said some things about this already. I've said, you know, more naturalistic qualitative work to complement quantitative work. Let's see. And I guess maybe I would add just like a persistent stance of questioning one's assumptions and asking the question. I mean, this is just what comes along with this dynamic perspective, I think, is asking the question, like, what is this piece of data telling me, and what does it tell me about how this student is thinking, and how general can I make a claim about how they're thinking from this little piece of data? And what can I imagine? Can I imagine ways that they'd be thinking differently? I think that's really a generative question for me. So if I see a student say something, I ask myself, how would I have to perturb the situation to see if they could think in a different way? How would I have to change the wording, or what kind of follow-up question would I ask to see what else is underneath? And sometimes that's as simple as just saying, what do you mean? Right? So I think I would encourage those kinds of thought experiments, I guess. What else? I think that covers it.
Okay. Kind of continuing on there, similarly, what recommendations do you have for bioeducation educators for how they address, you know, common misconceptions, the ones you cover in this paper and or others?
Right. That's a tough question. Like, one way I want to answer the question is just to say, I'm not sure these things are as important as we think they are. Like, I'm not sure we should be spending so much instructional time trying to correct these misconceptions, because I'm not convinced that students really deeply hold them. And even if they do, I'm not convinced that instructionally we're going to be able to sort of undo people's thinking in the amount of time that we have with students and the amount of time that we spend on any particular topic. So I don't know if that's going to be a very popular stance, but that's just the way that I think about it, and I understand that I'm not. I might be a little bit strange in that respect. So I would rather, like I said earlier, just focus on different learning goals. So even if I believe, you know, students have misunderstandings about the biological world, and even if I care that they do, and I want them to have correct understandings, my approach is still, as an educator, I want to get them thinking on their own. I want to get them engaged in thinking with data. I want them to have the confidence in their own thinking to question their own beliefs and assumptions. That's the kind of thing I want to build, and my assumption is that if I build up their capacity as independent and critical thinkers, that they will figure stuff out without me telling them what's right and what's wrong. So that's about as extreme as I can put it, I think.
There's two follow-up questions, and they come at the same question from slightly different approaches, and I think you've addressed them, but I want to be clear, or I want to utter them here just so that we answer them. So from two different views, both participants ask about the use of teleological language in teaching. and either using it as a way to teach versus alternative ways to use that language, or directly addressing it and refuting it using instructional time for either or. So do you have any recommendations, any different recommendations for folks as they think about using this kind of language as a teaching tool?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my view on it is that people are going to talk and think in ways that are sensible and useful to them. And it seems pretty obvious that teleological thinking is not absent from expert discourse at all. Like we sometimes find it a useful shorthand, and we know what we mean when we say species adapt in order to survive or whatever. We understand what those things mean, and yet it's useful to think about camouflage in terms of what the organism needs, in a sense, because they do in some sense need it, right, to avoid getting eaten. So I think there's something, I guess the higher level point that I want to make is that I don't think it's productive to tell people you can't talk in these ways or you can't think in these ways. I just don't think it's even possible. Like, people are going to talk and think in ways that are sensible and productive for them. I think it is fair to say, like, please be careful with your language, or like, when I ask you a question like this, I very clearly want you to be explicit and careful in how you write your response, because in this context, it matters to me how you craft your response. But I'm not going to police your language overall, as long as as long as it's possible in a conversation, for example, with a student to follow up and say, like, oh, what did you mean by that? So I guess I wouldn't say don't use the language. I would say, if the language matters, be clear about when and why it matters. But I think there's an interesting kind of analog in many analogs actually in physics education that I would encourage folks to look into. So for example, there are ideas about energy as a substance that are very common in the way people think. It's common in the way that I sometimes think about energy, like something has energy, right? And there's a lot of debate. There's been a lot of debate in physics about whether it's okay to talk about energy as a kind of substance-like thing, like, or should we say, well, you don't have energy. Energy is not a substance. Energy is an interaction, so that's not right. And yet, it's often useful to think about objects as sort of having a kind of energy. And so there's a really rich literature on just how to deal with that. And I think a lot of that literature has come down on the side of, it's okay to have shorthands and ways of thinking about things that are not completely precise, as long as you have opportunities to really delve into what that means and reconcile what that implies when it matters. In the particular instance when thinking about energy as a substance would get you the wrong thing, you have to be able to be flexible in the way that you're thinking. And I think the same applies to biologists and students, is that we want them to be flexible, not rigid, not say, you can't think this way, you can't talk this way, but to understand when it's okay to talk a particular way and think a particular way, and when you need to be more precise.
Great, thank you. All right, well, at this point then, I'm gonna, if I could have you put up the second to last slide.
Oh, okay, so I need to share, gotcha.